The Soviet Union didn't fall because of a political protest or a failed coup. It fell because of a single silent number, 570. That was the peak, in millions of metric tons, of Soviet oil production. It was hit in 1987, and then, for the first time in the state's history, the line on the chart began to slope down. Not because of sanctions, not because of war, but because the giant Siberian fields that powered everything were running out of pressure. The state was a machine that ran on oil exports, and the machine was seizing up from the inside. This is the energy historian, uncovering the hidden systems that power civilization. We remember the collapse as a parade of images, the Berlin Wall coming down, the red flag lowered over the Kremlin. We frame it as an ideological defeat, the end of a Cold War. But ideology doesn't pay for imports. Speeches don't heat apartment blocks in winter. The Soviet state was, in its final 2 decades, a petrostate. Its global influence, its military reach, the loyalty of its Eastern European satellites, and the basic stability of its consumer economy, all of it was purchased with crude oil and natural gas. When that flow peaked and then began to contract, the political structure didn't just face a crisis, it faced a mathematical reality it could not solve. The dependency was absolute. By the mid-1980s, oil and gas exports accounted for over 60% of the USSR's total hard currency earnings. That foreign currency was the only thing that could buy the grain to feed its cities, the advanced machine tools for its factories, and the consumer goods that maintained a bare semblance of social peace. The entire Soviet project in the 1970s had made a fatal pivot. Instead of reforming its inefficient industrial base, it would monetize its geology. Siberia would pay for everything. And for a while, it did. The oil boom of the 1970s funded the Soviet military buildup, subsidized the Eastern Bloc, and created an illusion of permanent prosperity. But that boom planted the seeds of a single inescapable vulnerability. The system's stability became a derivative of reservoir pressure. The early Siberian fields, like Samotlor, were colossal. They were also relatively easy to produce. You drilled, and the oil flowed. That flow funded the empire, but oil fields are not factories. They are finite systems governed by physics. As you extract the easy oil, the pressure drops. To keep production flat, you must invest exponentially more capital. You drill more wells. You inject water or gas to push the oil out. You move into smaller, more difficult pockets. The cost per barrel goes up. The energy return on investment goes down. By the early 1980s, the Soviet oil industry was in a desperate race, drilling thousands of new wells each year just to offset the decline from its aging giants. They were on a treadmill, and it was speeding up. Here's the catch the planners in Moscow couldn't engineer away. The Soviet economy was a net energy sink. Its heavy industry, its collective farms, its military-industrial complex, they consumed staggering amounts of energy per unit of output. The system was so inefficient that it needed constant growing inputs of cheap oil and gas just to stand still. There was no surplus efficiency to tap. So when maintaining oil production required more steel, more pipelines, more diesel for drilling rigs, it pulled those resources from the rest of the economy. The oil sector began cannibalizing the very state it was supposed to fund. It was a self-consuming loop. The energy needed to get energy was rising, and the rest of the country was starving for what was left. The peak in 1987 wasn't an accident. It was geology enforcing a budget. Production slipped to 569 million tons in 1988, then 607. No, wait, it kept falling, and with it, the state's financial oxygen disappeared. The timeline is critical. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, just as the fiscal walls were closing in. His reforms, Glasnost, are remembered as political choices, but they were also desperate attempts to generate economic growth without the oil windfall. He needed to make the Soviet economy productive on its own terms, but you cannot reform a system's fundamental efficiency in 5 years when its core energy subsidy is vanishing in real time. The politics of reform were overwhelmed by the physics of depletion. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc in 1989 looks different through this lens. The Soviet Union had long subsidized its satellite states with cheap oil, sold well below world market prices. This was the glue of the Warsaw Pact. When the USSR's own production faltered and it needed every dollar of hard currency, it cut those subsidies. It demanded payment in convertible currency, at world prices. Overnight, the economies of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia were plunged into crisis. The political protests that followed were, at their root, energy price shocks. The Soviet Empire didn't just lose its ideology, it lost its ability to pay for loyalty. The wall fell when the fuel shipments became too expensive. Inside the USSR itself, the consequences were visceral. With hard currency reserves evaporating, grain imports plummeted. Empty shelves weren't just a symbol of economic failure, they were a direct consequence of a failed oil well in West Siberia. The state could no longer import its way out of agricultural inefficiency. Then, the final, brutal mechanism kicked in, the internal energy crisis. As the state prioritized oil for export to earn currency, domestic refineries were starved. Gasoline and diesel shortages began to paralyze the already fragile distribution network. In the winter of 1990 to 91, even heating fuel became unreliable. The state was freezing from the inside out. This is the counterintuitive truth the title promises. The Soviet Union didn't fall because its ideology was rejected. It fell because its energy model hit a physical limit. The political superstructure collapsed because its material foundation, the constant, growing flow of cheap Siberian oil, could no longer be sustained. The crisis was diagnosed as political, but the cause was geological. The system wasn't defeated in battle, it was bankrupted by its own wells. The entire communist project unraveled at the speed of declining reservoir pressure. One material now decided the fate of a superpower. The transition from global power to fractured states moved at the speed of a depleting oil field. The Soviet collapse was the first modern example of an advanced industrial state disintegrating under energy constraints. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a revolution in the classical sense. It was a slow-motion corporate liquidation, where the core asset stopped producing cash flow. The lesson isn't that oil equals power. It's that when a complex system becomes structurally dependent on a single depleting resource flow, its stability is a derivative of that flow's trajectory. The Soviet state optimized itself for extraction, not resilience. When the extraction curve bent, every subsystem calibrated to its military, political, social bent with it. The fragility was built into the design. The system was so perfectly adapted to the era of expanding energy that it had no contingency for contraction. Today, we look at nations and see politics, armies, economies. But beneath that, there is always a material flow energy, minerals, food. The Soviet story makes visible what is usually invisible, that political power is a downstream effect of physical surplus. When the surplus shrinks, the power dynamics rearrange themselves, often violently. The maps change long after the geology has issued its verdict. If this changed how you see the system, subscribe. The hidden infrastructure is always there. Now you know where to look.